welcome to Mind, Crime, Liberty Show with me, Swindon Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss the right-wing case for abolishing the police. Tim.
So this is going to get into somewhat deep waters of political rights and what's quote-unquote realistic. I get horrified at the way in which the police, the ATF, the FBI, the Secret Service, and various other agents of the U.S. government, as well as other governments, but as an American, I'll just talk about the American cases to most extent, basically more or less violate everyone's rights. And of course, in places like Britain and Canada, of course, you have no rights in like the sort of formal sense here, because at least in theory, the United States, you have right, Fourth Amendment, no searches and seizures and so forth, right to assembly, right to bear arms, at least on paper. Thanks Thomas Jefferson and James Madison for those. And also, there's a perfect process known as civil asset forfeiture here in the United States, and more or less, police steal more money than take more money than burglars. It goes up and down. It depends on what you're counting here, but it's roughly the same here, which is terrible. Recently in January 2025, they finally ended this airport seizure thing, where they would just have, if you're carrying large amounts of cash, you'd have to basically prove why. So people couldn't carry large amounts of cash. And by the way, the real criminals would just be using private jets, who would be calling huge amount of cash anyway. So a lot of this stuff is this here. So I'm going to get into this more deeper here. The right-wing case for abolishing the police. So I might be the only person who thinks that Derek Chauvin is innocent, but plenty of other cops, ATF, FBI, Secret Service, are guilty. So the elites picked the one event where it's like he probably died of an overdose. But you could find plenty of other examples of police being quote unquote terrible. There's a guy called the civil rights lawyer. He's from West Virginia, and he details police brutality. And he would make the point, which I think is basically obvious, that police are equal opportunity, and the same way with the broadly law enforcement, are equal opportunity victim hunters. And actually one of the areas which the proportion of black officers to society is about the same percentage, 12% versus 13.6 demographic sample. So that's a fairly close tracking. And also the problem with the people who just focus on the race aspect is some of the stuff go the other way also. And when you find out that police are less likely to shoot blacks now, that there was a sort of first-person shooter study that was done. Again, this stuff's very hard to prove. This gets into sort of like epistemology type metaphysics discussions here. How do you quote-unquote prove this stuff? And also, I will just point out that it's not like in Egypt or Dubai or Nigeria, which are non-white, non-Western countries by the normal sense of the word. It's not like exactly they have quote-unquote nice police. So it's not like police are some sort of local thing here. But there's plenty of other examples of actual police misconduct here in the United States, which I would be totally against here. There was a case where a veteran was going to buy a boat, and he was carrying all in cash, and gets it all stolen by the by the ATF, of course. And he was actually made the mistake of just permitting them to do these fishing operations. There's another example where there was a church that was collecting money for charity, stolen. These are and so forth. And there was a recent case local to my area as well, where an off-duty policeman chases a motorcycle, and he basically holds him up. It's basically a holdup. And the guy doesn't have any idea who he is. So that's a particularly terrible one here. And again, when these quote-unquote settlements get paid out, they don't get paid out of the officers or the police's accounts. They get tacked on to taxpayers. So even when you have these verdicts, so I think something like $765 million every year is paid out in New York City alone to police misconduct stuff. And some of these settlements are like $100 million, and so forth. So, so that's one thing that police, even if you have police accountability, it doesn't really exist in the sense that the public loses both ways. And another problem with police is police are the ones who enforce things like child protection services, which arrest parents for letting kids walk home. The police enforce things like hate crime acts in places like England and the United States. If the police do abolish weapons in the United States, if the state does abolish weapons in the United States, the police will be doing ones. The police will be ones that are also violating those rights too. And police themselves aren't particularly traditional. So if you go back to the 1700s, they didn't really exist. London is one of the first cities with a police force in the 1830s or so. Some of the cities in the United States and Europe start copying that later on. But so police aren't thousands of years old. The modern professionalized police and law enforcement, it's a relatively recent phenomenon. And like secret police services like FBI and these three-letter agencies that various countries have, again, as many people point out, the Tsarists only had a few hundred, if not a few thousand agents. The Stalinists had like 100,000 or something like that at one point, or something like 16,000. So I'm going to keep moving on here. Cops don't make roads safer. So if you want to make the argument that we need cops to enforce road laws, it's been pointed out by Strong Towns, and they did a study on this, that like a lot of the issues with you don't really need, the police don't make road safety. What you should do is liberalize speed limits on highways, so no purposely low speed limits, and then have traffic calming measures where pedestrians are, like actual speed bumps and things like that. And there's no reason why speeding tickets can't be enforced. If you want to do speeding tickets, can't be enforced virtually. Anyway, and another issue of cops is cops invent crimes out of law-abiding citizens. The war on drugs is, in general, a part of this. But even if you want to talk about the enforcement of a lot of these things, they get caught themselves planning evidence and creating crime where there isn't. So there's many instances where police get caught and they don't really ever, quote unquote, get held to, quote unquote, justice. And when it comes to actual villains, like in Uvalde, where there was a school shooting, the cops did not storm the school. So they have all these advanced weaponry and there's all these, but when it comes to an actual threat, cops are generally cowards. Which brings me to my main point here. When actual violence and actual unrest happens, which isn't controlled demolition organized by the ruling class, the police are generally unable to contain it. And a good example of that is the Korean rooftop militias defending themselves and their businesses during the LA riots, which I'm going to bring to my broader point here, which my core idea, which is the topic today, is that was a bunch of background information about the police. The professional standing army of the police should be replaced by militias and or private security, which doesn't have, and these are the key attributes, it doesn't have any qualified immunity, legal privileges, and of course, nothing. So in many cases, we don't need cops. Cops are, again, to repeat this, cops are a relatively new phenomena. It did not begin something like in the first century. Militias, in my opinion, would be underrated. And this is where I think, and this is where my first question for you, Swithin, here is, what do you think would be before I get into my other points, what do you think would be what's your general take on my empirical case against the police? Now I'm getting to my more theoretical police. Do you agree in general with my claims the police don't actually enforce that many crimes? Many crimes go unsolved anyway. That's something that people don't forget. They enforce anarcho-tyranny when they do. If someone robs your house and you were to defend yourself with them, I imagine in England, if you probably used anything else that you'd probably go to jail. There was actually a famous case recently that happened in Britain that Peter Hitchens was talking about. So what would you make in my empirical case? And then what would you get in my first inkling of the private, the local militias or private security? Swithin, thanks for doing the topic.
You're certainly right about self-defense in England. There was a case recently, I think it was an Eastern European woman who was attacked by a man, and I think she'd been raped in the past as well, and she had sort of good grounds thinking this guy wasn't going to be particularly pleasant towards her. And she had a knife and stabbed him and killed him. But because she had carried a knife, that this was beyond the pale, and so she's still in jail for murder, even though no one denies it was self-defense, because it wasn't quote unquote reasonable force. It's kind of seems, from what I heard, it doesn't seem mostly massively unreasonable. But yeah, you're definitely right. So, I mean, a lot of the right wingers would agree with you entirely about how the police are and what laws that they enforce. I suppose And so the right wing response to this, or the traditional response, would be, well, that's the police don't make the laws, this enforce, and what we need is just to change the laws, and then we'd have good police. That would be the normal defense of it, and then to say, well, if we didn't have the police, then there'd be anarchy. So that's really going to be your standard response. How would you respond to the, oh well, we just need better laws, and then they would enforce it, and they'd be enforcing good things rather than bad ones.
Yeah, I understand the point, which is where I'm going to get into the point in itself. I would say that there's no, libertarianism in general and anarchism, which is two similar things here, is a theory about why, and I think it's boiled down to this great graph that's on the Libertarian Institute, where you have, if, on the left-hand side of the column, it says, men are angels, and the men aren't angels. There's the two things on the left. And on the right, on the top of the column, it says state, no state. So if men are angels, and there's people above you with authority and a state, then why would angels, first of all, need a state? But even if angels were given state power and privileges, they wouldn't disabuse them. And if there's no state, angels wouldn't need no state anyway. And like they wouldn't have any crimes to enforce anyway. So under no state, you're also fine. But the thing is, if men aren't angels, and you give them the ability, power, and privilege, so to speak, especially legal power and privilege, then you turn a bad situation under a state into a worse situation. I think you have a great joke. What do you call a group of people in charge but not in jail or something like that? The gang that's in charge but not in jail. That's what a good description of the state. So and actually in developing societies, it's like people put it, Bukele in El Salvador used to have gang ties supposedly. So in some sense, there's literal relationships between. We did an episode on Keith Presley on this, the relationship between states and organized crime. So that would be my theoretical. That would be my theoretical thing. If you give people legal privilege, they're going to act. They're going to act dishonestly. If you give people a way out. Now, the case against me is, well, what if you just got rid of qualified immunity? They were personally liable for the damages they do. This is why I unironically think the police unions are quote unquote right. And this is where I'm going to get into William Gillis here. William Gillis is a bit of a critic of Keith Preston. That's actually how I found him. And he has two essays on the police here. And one of the points he makes is that the police themselves, especially since the 70s, are a problem for most Western state ruling classes. They're in a way kind of. Now, he calls them medieval, which is technically wrong, but I get the point he's making. And his point is that the police attract rot. The police aren't the best people. Like if you end up in the police, you kind of did something wrong. So like if you did the kind of reforms that some minarchist libertarians and progressives want to do on the police, you're going to make the police significantly less desirable job. Now people still might do it, so to speak. But this still gets into the problem was, in a lot of cases, like in my local case, there was an example where an off-duty cop in a totally unmarked car pulls a gun on a speeding motorcycle. Well, we don't know if he's speeding, but that's what they claim. And he made up a whole police report. And the district attorney and the prosecutor is supposed to go, charge this guy. But she didn't. And it's a she, too. It's funny enough. She didn't charge him. So even if you have the accountability laws that people on the left, libertarians and good Jacobin want, you still need prosecutors and district attorneys of the state. And as oftentimes find out, the state investigates itself and didn't do anything wrong. This goes back to my graph about angels and states here, which I think is the core of quote unquote anarchism. So I would say we already have, to some extent, bad anarchy. And the people enforcing the laws are in some case the worst, because like it's just to me, the William Gillis case against the cops is sociologically correct in the sense they're just not the finest apples. Now, I'm not saying they shouldn't have a right to do stuff here, but like I just don't really know what the DEA or ATF does in our society. I don't even know what I don't know what the FBI does. Is it defending us against the Russians, or is it putting people in jail who don't, or is it like going around spreading drugs? I mean, this was the whole church committee stuff about in the 70s here. It was giving out LSD and stuff like that. So again, why don't you go arrest? And there's a whole Tom Cruise movie made out of drug running between, and there's a guy who accused Bill Clinton of Arkansas. I have every reason to believe this is the case here. So that's sort of my broad attack against your first point here, is that law enforcement are powerless against the ruling class. And then against everyone else, they're just kind of goons, unaccountable goons. Now, the middle class, to some extent, is put in between both, and some of the middle class side with the pro-police, some of the middle class side with the anti-police. But my position is generally the middle class right should decide with the anti-police people for theoretical reasons and for, quite frankly, practical reasons too. So that's where I'm starting to start getting my other cases to here. So what would you make so far, Swithin, of this thing? Do you agree with the point about legal privileges? But even if you have laws on the books that hold police accountable, you need district attorneys and prosecutors to prosecute them. And if they have kid gloves, nothing really is going to change here. So a lot of the reforms that the minarchists and the progressives that like Jackman make, I just don't think they're going to quote unquote work. That's my thing. Maybe I'm too cynical and pessimistic about it, but that'd be my first response. What do you make of my second round of comments with him?
So yeah, I mean, I entirely agree with qualified immunity and things. I mean, the police should be held to the same legal standards as everyone else. So I mean, the police can compel and keep you questioning, and you have to stay there for I think in England it's like 3 days or 2 days, and then and if they don't charge you, they have to let you go. But it's like, well, you've left me for 2 days, and you decided to do that, and I couldn't work for 2 days. But then the police don't bear any cost for that. So even in sort of the line of like general normal policing activity, they can effectively impose costs on other people without bearing them. Now, of course, you could say, well, we had reasonable suspicion to keep you in for questioning. Okay, fair enough. But if that's the case, why don't the police just get insurance and go, okay, we did it by the book. He wasn't guilty. Okay, so the insurance company, we claim on the insurance and you pay out. Fine. So why not do that? But no. The police can basically kidnap people for a few days because they want to. Oh, we didn't charge you. So, okay, let you go. So there's a whole host of things, even sort of like the way in which they operate with the normal operation is vastly different from what a regular citizen can do. But of course, you can make the utilitarian argument. Oh, yes, but we need a special class of people to be able to enforce the law, because otherwise, all those small bad people will overrun the society. So, I mean, with your sort of the angels, and if we have angels, we don't need government, and then if we don't have angels, then we don't have government. I mean, then the response to that is, well, yeah, okay, fair enough, but there are better people and worse people, and just as long as we get the better people in, then that's going to be a good thing.
Do you, quick interruption, do you think the sociological case that William Gillis made about police attracting rot, again, is largely correct? Do you think that's, and I've come to think this is the case. Maybe I'm off base here.
I think that's probably true, but I think you could probably make an equal case for private security to some extent as well. I mean, my general impression I get of bouncers at nightclubs is they're a pain, even though they don't have qualified immunity and stuff. So I actually think for a lot of this kind of work, you might end up attracting people with particular personality styles to do it. So a bit like if you have a standard sort of school, like a private school, even if it was a government one, but it ran similarly with the curriculum and whatever as a public one, and same sort of grading style, you'd still probably end up with similar personalities of teacher in that than you would do in a public school you want a private one, because they're effectively doing similar things. And even in private security, especially if you've got a couple of guys with you and you're well trained, if you wanted to go on a power trip, you probably could. Now, obviously, with the extra costs involved, you'd be less likely to do it. But I still think you're going to get certain people who are likely to turn them. Similarly, if you had like private militias of like specialist soldiers, you may well might well attract to some extent relatively aggressive men, because, well, that's the type of person who's going to go into that. So I think. Go.
I would agree. Sorry to interrupt, but I would agree. But wouldn't you say that the issue is then they would be fun? So, like, if I go onto a, let's say, Disney World, or let's say some private business car lot, and they have private security outside, the private security probably won't follow me 10 miles away on a car chase across the town. But public, quote-unquote, police will, and then they will call you for felony for fleeing them. But private security can't really do that. Now, maybe they do it out of thrill, but then I can defend myself legally, quote-unquote, defend myself once I leave there. I will get into the militia discussion in a second here, but what would you make about that comment? Like, you have to fund your own...
I think that's true. I think that's true, but if you had a more expanded role of the police, because the thing is, when it comes to private security, to a large extent, it's more of a case of just removing from the property and somebody else's problem. When you're dealing with crimes rather than sort of torts, so the private security stuff you use at present, you kind of have a pre-existing implicit or explicit contractual relation. And so the bounds of what the private security do or don't do is pretty clear. When you're dealing with crimes where there's no prior contract, implicit or explicit, sort of like theft or whatever, then it opens you up to doing more and trying to find and apprehend the individual in a way that you probably don't in the same way for like private security. And also, if someone did steal something from like Disneyland and loads of stuff, they probably get the police to do it rather than the private security. One thing else to remember is when it comes to actual prosecution of actions of the police, if it was the case that there was a general norm in society, because I think a lot of it matters about culture, is if people think that a certain group are generally okay and there's just some bad eggs and they think, well, if we didn't have them, things would be way worse. Even if the bad eggs are there, they'll try not to like treat them too harshly. Because I think that's probably the conscious motivation of the district attorneys who won't prosecute the police, because they kind of think, well, the police are kind of on our side. Now, obviously, there's a more incestuous relationship with the current system with that than it might be in principle. But if you have a situation where people generally feel like, oh, yeah, they're on the inside on ours and they're just dealing with these other people, and yeah, okay, they go a step over the line a bit, but the people they're dealing with a lot is hard work and pain. And interestingly, this is where the body cam stuff comes in. But actually, in a lot of situations, the police are actually pretty patient dealing with some crazed individuals. Now, hashtag not all police, obviously. But they do show a lot of restraint in certain circumstances. And so I think we'll get into much in a second, but I think whether someone is prosecuted or not, what matters as well is not just what's on the statute books, but also the perception that whoever happens to prosecute them has about their role in society as a whole. And I think the sort of district attorneys fundamentally see the police as good. And so irrespective of what's on that, as you said, they'll treat them with kid gloves.
I think that's the fairest point you can make in defense of the people who defend law enforcement in general. I would just say, though, that there is a problem, though, of that the state is creating an army of increasingly libertarians. Like, the very fact that I'm making this argument, considering who I am, would be insane to someone 50 years ago, probably, that I'm making this argument that there is such a thing as a right-wing case against professional police or right-wing professional state police, so to speak. The very fact that would be think of as what in the world had to happen for that to happen. So that would be my big ticket response there. And I also think that there's a bit of the corporate welfare, and this is where I think the anarchist libertarians are the most left-wing people out there. And this includes, if indeed Disney, these large corporations, in the same way that Kevin Carson makes the point that the highways are disproportionately used by the megacorps and yet are taxed on everyone, I would also say that, in this regard, this was pointed out during riots, that if local people like the business, there's Keith Preston would point out that a skate shop, no one hijacked the skate shop, or no one would burn the skate shop down, or no one would burn the pizzeria down. Now, maybe there's some mafia ties on some of this and other things here. But a lot of violence, I'm not going to say it's justified, but there is a sense in which, especially after the 2008 financial bailout and other corporate welfare programs the state does, I do think there is this argument to be made that some of these megacorps, I'm not totally in agreement with Keith Preston on this, but I'm also not in total disagreement either. But skate shops generally don't get looted. Walmart gets looted. So that's some of the optics of it. Of some of the stuff. So if you pick the right victims, so to speak, of your quote unquote violence, then maybe you're quote unquote okay. I'm using a lot of quotes there, but I'm trying to get the kind of point across that even when it comes to crime, you have to think about the other crimes that happen, which goes back to my broader point about society and what counts as theft and non-theft here. And this might sound very quote unquote left wing, and I think to some extent it is. But I would just say, if that's the case, then a better society is what some people on I would say the vulgar right is actually left wing. Now, I would say this is where things get weird, though. I would say that for the progressive leftists, not the left wing anarchists like Keith Preston, there's progressive leftists. This is where they get an awkward relationship with the police, because for one thing, and Gillis points this out, for one thing, he's surprised that the Clintons didn't try to create a parallel organization to replace the state police. It's entirely a reasonable idea. It's not an insane idea. In some ways, they sort of, in the same way that if you had local, after the civil rights era, you basically just changed the schools into, you sort of had a new schooling. It's not entirely reasonable that the managerial state would just get rid of the sort of parochial police and sheriff's departments. That's not entirely reasonable. And just make them kind of quote unquote woke. That's one thing that could happen. And that's another reason I think the right should be quick they should oppose it now while there's no new institution out there. That's one reason. And the second reason I think it is that the militias, it's oddly enough, do you if militias could, in cities that in England, if militias were in charge, the progressive lefties might actually think the militias are racist. And this is the funniest. This is where I think the case for abolishing the police get interesting. So on the one side you have private security, but on the other side you have public militias. Wouldn't these public quote unquote communal militias? Now you could also make the point about rot regarding militias, but now we're just getting into general sociological state of human, what motivates humans, and are humans innately good? I started out by saying this might get into deep waters, and this is where I think the real issue lies here. Is you would have, and this goes back to the skate shop point here. If your neighbors and so forth, there's a certain continuity there. There's a certain community there, and it's a thicker community in the Walter Block sense here too. Which again, this is all very much quote unquote culturally right wing, and this is one of the reasons why I think abolishing the professional police force, because would you burn down a gym you went to? Would you burn down a church that your friends go to? Would you burn down or loot or steal from a store you shop at? Probably not. Now, the alienated mega corporations. I mean, this is somewhat a problem here. So, what do you make of these broad comments I'm making about society, Swithin? Like, I maybe not all the way on the Keith Preston side that you should loot Walmart, but I'm especially after COVID. Like, I just don't really basically the state looted local businesses during COVID. Functionally, that's functionally what the state did for a year and a half, on behalf of Amazon. I mean, no one cared about that. I mean, you and I cared, but not anyone else, not people generally. So I'm much more cynical about the way corporate and other society. And do you think Kevin Carson is right that the police would be, at the behest of the megacorps? Do you think they disproportionately use and benefit from the police? Swithin?
It's hard to say whether they definitely benefited in 2020, although that was a somewhat unusual situation. I suppose it depends how you'd measure it. Well, they would use it more insofar as they sell more, and so for that reason, they would prosecute people more probably. Then you got to look at the taxes. It's going to be possibly they probably do, but then the question is how much they pay for it. But then you get the whole road situation. Oh, what's interesting with the roads actually is Kevin Carson would like this near a motorway, like a freeway in England. There was a big Amazon warehouse that started up, and then not long after they started building a new motorway junction, so you could get off and go to like the warehouse, or more than likely you wouldn't do that. The truck from the warehouse would go there. And I was thinking, I'm pretty sure Amazon said they might only turn up if they got this thing built for them. I'm pretty sure that probably happened. But with your looting of Walmart, I think this is interesting because I think the people who defend the police as it currently form, what they would generally say is what we need is local police. I think in an American context, they very much should be against the FBI, the DEA, the ATF, etc. They should all be abolished. You should just have state police. And what people want, and this is what it seems to be what people on the Spanish Street like, what they want is a return to sort of personal policing, where you have local policeman who walks the same area and everybody knows who he is. This came up. I haven't watched all of them, but I'm currently watching The Wire, which is, you may not know, it is an HBO series from the early 2000s. And one of the things that the community meetings is that it said there, that what they like is, knowing who the police are. And one of the guys who's higher up in the organization goes for a lower rank role because he's just on the beat and he's dealing with actual people. And this is what actually improves the relation. It improves the relationship people have with the police, because they kind of see them, they kind of know them, they know the person as well outside like a crime context, and they kind of feel like, okay, they're on their side. Since sort of like the 1960s, when prevalence of cars and things, you have basically reactive policing, which is interesting. I was listening to something on big data, sort of digital ID stuff. And a lot of it was framed, and Tony Blair was saying, because he's a big digital ID guy, was always good because the police would be able to respond quicker. And I'm kind of thinking, but one of the original ideas of the police was they were supposed to prevent crime, not just react to crime. And this very sort of, we're just in a police car and then we just appear from nowhere, is something that people don't tend to like particularly. And also is bad because it's much better to prevent crime than it is to react to crime. If you were to defend the police, I think that's the type of police that people in theory kind of defend. And that's kind of what Peter Hitchens defends, because Peter Hitchens goes on about how police became reactive. They didn't do beat runs and stuff like that. The question would arise, would you be able to return to that? Was that even ideal to begin with? And even if it is ideal, isn't it better you do that without legal privilege? To which the answer is, well, yes. So those would be my sort of broad thoughts on that.
Do you think that this would be? Do you think this sounds more or less like a paid like a paid. See, the problem to me with a lot of this sounds like a paid militia, basically. Like, the problem to me with a lot of these things is how to unwind the managerial state, or how to get back to a earlier version of the managerial state, or how to a post-managerial state version. Because the police are very much part of the managerial revolution. They're arguably, you could think about what's the most important part of the managerial revolution is. It could be the police. I mean, it very well could be that they're like this is where, in an odd sense, where I think, some people on the right might say, if you abolish the police, you'll get communism, because, well, the labor unions would take over. But then we have to just have a discussion over, what's wrong with labor unions? Or aren't we free to assemble? This is where I'm not, totally opposed to syndicalism. I'm also not opposed to owners of production uniting together either. I mean, that's also, but if you're going to take freedom of assembly seriously, that's the way. So to me, the problem with the Peter Hitchens style argument is how would that look like? Now, again, there's a way in which you could obviously imagine this to be the case here, that you could just have local police that walk around and so forth. That's to some extent the case. But then you have to ask, where is crime happening? And this is, again, where I'm, to some extent, crime is happening in areas where it happens in the same area. That's one of the issues here. And that's where a lot of the sort of, somewhat right-of-center conservatives who are pro-police, I think Glenn Loury is a black conservative, make a lot of these type arguments. It's, if anything, if you take the crime rate seriously, they're under report on certain things. So, I do not hold the view that Jacobin or some groups like that hold on the police here. But nonetheless, I still unironically have come to recently start supporting the position here. But my end position would be either private security or local militias, or just self-defense. If crime indeed happens at a large scale, and I mean a large scale as in something that's regular, something that happens all the time, that's like a quasi-state institution. That's like a mafia. That's like a gang. A gang is a kind of like business. And if you're going to take out a gang, you need a gang yourself. This to me is a problem of society and humans themselves. If it's just a little crime, I think locals can enforce that quite easily. But if it's generalized, then I think it's a big problem here. And I don't know what to do about it. But then this is where we're going to get into, I would say that, I entirely agree with you that, proactive policing, in the sense that you prevent crime, is better. I mean, deterrence. So you maybe have one walk the beat so that people don't, do things. I think in certain developed third world countries that have tourist areas, they'll have police and security guards near restaurants and so forth. And that's great. But the issue is that the issue to me is, if that's everywhere, I mean, this is just a kind of, zombie apocalypse type scenario here, and the pension police aren't going to stand up for your rights in those situations here. And actually, I think in places that are get multiculturalized, that's what starts to happen anyway. So I'm sympathetic to the Peter Hitchens argument, by the way. I just don't know how you get back to I don't know how you get back to that. Maybe if we all, maybe if we get more localized production, we could get back to that. Maybe if people are less transient, we could get back to that. But one of the reasons not to be transient, it would be that you moving to a new town would be actually a more socially costly event. The fact that you can just get up and move to another part of the United States and just drop yourself, or another part of the world and just drop yourself, and have expectations of being treated perfectly well. I mean, that actually might be, this is where, again, a lot of the normie rightists, when you start mentioning these points, get kind of weirded out at you. Are you anti-capitalist? Well, I do think that, if you're a Christian, you're supposed to, love thy neighbor and not kill and so forth. But the question of dealing with very far away foreigners is a question. Yeah, I do have this sort of, J.D. Vance had this, versus the two popes had this sort of argument on Twitter and various things over what order of priorities do you have between your family, your relatives, your friends, and the people 10,000 miles away. I think the quote that I think is G.K. Chesterton makes fun of this one, calls it telescopic altruism. But I do think like that if crime is sufficiently bad, I just don't think the state's going to have much good. The state, in many ways, is oftentimes when we do deep histories 100 years later, it turns out the state was actually bankrolling a lot of the crime that was happening, or creating laws that create the mafias that create the crime. The prohibition is a classic example. So that would be my response to you, Swithin. What would you make about this? Like, it seems like the state has a Goldilocks problems, where it's like, if there's no crime, you don't need a state. If there's a lot of crime, the state is either doing anarcho-tyranny and supporting it, or it's just of no use. Like, I think people get their cell phones stolen and bikes stolen in downtown London. And do the police go out and look for them? No. that'd be my response there. What would you make of that?
Oh yeah, I think that's true. Although I mean, I suppose you could respond to that with the private militia and private security, that, if there's no crime, you don't need them, and then if there's loads of crime, and they're probably not going to be able to do anything anyway. Which is why I think actually to a large degree, self-defense is even more important than the private militia things. If it's the case that people can defend themselves and they can respond, because the thing is, even with private security walking a beat, that unless you have like an army of them walking around that are always there, they're always going to have reaction times. There's only be times where you'd be able to get away with it. But if you've got men who are well sort of military trained or combat trained, who are basically everywhere, then to the extent that the bad actors are quite small, they're always going to come against opposition. So I think the big thing here is kind of self-defense. As an aside with that, it'd be interesting to see whether men or women support the police. I have a sneaking suspicion that single mothers support the police more than anyone else. Have just come to me, because they're in a position of not being able to defend themselves in any way, particularly any way, meaningful way, shape or form. And so they want the police to protect them. It's something that just came to mind. Also, sorry, just on the prohibition, as you mentioned it, I remember hearing an argument that one of the motivating factors behind prohibition was that they would know that it was going to be, law was going to be broken consistently. And they knew the police would have to do a lot about it. And effectively, the police supported it because they knew that prohibition would mean increased police budgets. And this was one of the motivating factors for supporting it, because, it's going to go wrong, but it means we'll get more money. We'll get a bigger budget so we can do more good stuff. I haven't had any corroborating evidence for that, but it would make entire sense if it were true. So that's a bit of a scrambled response. But I think my main point here, I'd say, is I think self-defense is probably the most important factor here, which actually the police prevent you from doing. And this is what the power elite currently do, is to prevent anybody from defending themselves. They always come down hard on anybody who defends themselves. Always. Even
in the United States, sorry to interrupt, but even in the United States, on the margins, in places like New York City and Chicago and Los Angeles, they have all sorts of rules about what you can and cannot carry, and like where you can carry it. So like on the margins, they've tried even though we have the formal Second Amendment, on the margins, they've gone after certain things. I will say though, the thing about if there's, you said if there's a lot of crime, the private militia wouldn't. I think if you really cared about your community and there was a lot of crime and there wasn't a lot of crime 20 years ago, you could organize yourself to go after it if you had the social bonds to do so. I think, but again, of course, the state prevents you to do this. This is the Korean rooftop militia examples here. I think that's a great thing that during the LA riots, this is the skaters protecting their skate shops. Like if there are one-off events that happen from time to time, of outside marauders coming in, then I think you can actually unite and defend yourself. And this is where I would say that, like, once, if that's the case, then you're getting into Hans Hoppe's Thousand Liechtensteins type territory here. Maybe one centralized group of marauders would eventually take over, but even if that would take a while, and in between, then I think you'd have a pretty good time of growth of capital, growth of local capital, growth of local people's bonds, and so forth. So that would be my case here. Your point about how the police make it illegal to defend yourself is true, but I would also say they make self-defense also illegal after the fact in certain these things. The Kyle Rittenhouse trial is a classic example of that. Again, I know Kyle Rittenhouse is not the perfect person, but he was quote unquote trying to defend himself, and then after the fact they hauled him out to try to go after him, to try to make a point. So like in these one-off events where there's high crime, then you can organize yourself against the gang and form a counter gang. Like in Mexico, Keith Preston will point out in certain provinces you have like local guys who drive around. I think it's in one of the northwestern provinces. This is probably the lowest crime area of Mexico, other than the resorts themselves. And what basically exists is a local militia, but it's not professional. They don't get paid. It's volunteer. Which you could argue that's a bad thing, but this is where I'm not like this crass pro-capitalist guy here. Like I do things for no money, which I think are useful for people I know all the time. I'm not, I think this is where I think Gillis who thinks altruism, and I'm talking about, first of all, I would say certain forms of altruism are beneficial to me. So it's in my self-interest. Anyway. But second of all, I do think the people who would sign up for a local militia are probably not yuppie 20-year-olds, who, like if you think about who would sign up for like a patriot, militia in Wales or in Northern England, who would actually sign up for that? Who, not like, and who would do it on their own volunteer time? Now, oddly enough, the cultural left, like Noam Chomsky, might not exactly like that as much as they claim to. So this is where your point about single women, may exactly, like this is where what I'm thinking about the abolishing the police, like it's kind of funny, like who would actually benefit and disbenefit. Now, you could argue that if you abolish the police, you just abolish the whole state. And that could be the case. Although I think you could still have if a state still controls the money supply and still has private security to control the banks, I do still think they could probably collect taxes in some draconian ways, like just controlling trade exits or ports. I do think that's possible. So you could still have all the other aspects of the modern state without local and police and ATF and FBI. It's possible. So there is a point where if you abolish the police, do you abolish the rest of the managerial state? Do you unwind the rest of the managerial state if you do that? That's one of the sort of questions here. I wouldn't care about that happening. But again, this is where it's like I'm trying to think through the politics of what would, if you could, in theory, abolish this and replace this, what would happen to society? What would you make broadly about my comments here? We're approaching the hour, Swithin.
I think it still exists. Historically, the state existed without the police in its modern form. I fail to see why it couldn't collect taxes. As long as enough people think that the state is legitimate in certain respect, and you think, you should should pay taxes. I think a lot of people would do it anyway, and a few raids here and there with tax guys, with the support of the judiciary and stuff behind you. Yeah, I think you could do that. Maybe you wouldn't collect as many, but yeah, I fail to see why that couldn't work in the absence of the modern police. With respect to militias, I think yes, if there's a specific threat, I think you can get militias. What I was referring to there was just crime in general, but there's always going to be a situation where someone who isn't so specifically trained doing a job is not going to be there, and then yes, crime could take place, you can get away with it. And so that's why I was saying that sort of self-defense is the most important when it comes to that, which then of course comes to like firearm carry and stuff. Which interesting though as well, when it comes to firearm carry, is actually that would probably benefit women more than men on average, assuming that women carried weapons to a decent degree, because it would then mean that the odds, well, if you wanted to rob somebody, rob a woman, it's probably going to be a better idea on average than robbing a man, because it's going to be more difficult. And so if you knew that they could carry, then they're going to be more of a problem. To your Chomsky point, yeah, I don't think Chomsky would like his sort of local militias if they arrived. I think that's I don't think he would like that, because the militia guys, you might get some young guys, but I reckon you mostly get guys in their 50s who are sort of 40s and 50s in the local area who've got kids or grown up. And the guys at gun range is like an old veteran of some description. It's going to be those kind of guys who are going to go around. Obviously, some younger guys as well, but I imagine like the community police type guys, you probably get them, and well, they're probably going to be quite conservative. Put it out there.
I mean, you could argue that's quote unquote worse. It depends on what your perspective is. But keep in mind, they don't have legal privilege. They have a court system that still exists of some variety. They don't have quote-unquote legal privilege. And they have to fund themselves. So that's like, if you're paying for the gas, or it's your own legs walking, your own food to walk out and do this, you're going to be a lot more studious about your what you do and what you don't do. And also, the other people can also get their guys to come in and protect them if they're worth while protecting. If you're half decent, if you're a person that's that have social ties to something, you will also have your guys to come in. Now, again, this could just turn into quote unquote bad anarchy. But my counter to that is, wouldn't you say that's already happening in some ways anyway, in places like London, where you have to carry your cell phone. In certain cities, you have to carry your cell phone and you can't take it out. And if you get certain things stolen, you just basically accept it as a fact of life. And based on the political scene, it seems like the political scene is not exactly. It's not like we're having gentlemen's democracy debates out there anyway. I mean, elections are basically just competitions between warring gangs anyway. Or they're just organized from above. So my point here is that when people say, especially conservatives say that crime would take over, I mean, I just don't know. If you have in the United States, you'll have these large people have we don't call the police, we follow the Second Amendment, and I'm like, there's the comedian Owen Benjamin point we made. No, you don't. I mean, this is like, if you actually shoot someone who's trespassing, the state's going to come after you in all likelihood, and it's going to be the police that are doing it. So, you have to think about who's your enemy. I do wonder if this would happen, because people would point out the Kurds are kind of like a militia. And many people would point out that internally some of the Kurds are quite patriarchal, although people like Brent Langle would dispute that. But in places like this where it does happen, I just think it'd be interesting to bear out. I just no longer offer any support intellectually or morally or socially to the police. I don't really buy the back the blue argument. Maybe I did for a little bit, but actually, upon further review, I more or less totally distance myself, which is one of the reasons why I want to do this episode here, is to sort of publicly distance myself from not what I say probably matters per se. Maybe in 100 years, what I say will matter, but I think a broad movement of distance yourself, from the police, and events like January 6th and COVID really solidified my long term have solidified my dislike of the state and the goons who make the state's rules possible. That's my final comment, Swithin. Thanks for doing this episode. Maybe it will be bad anarchy if you do this, but I would say bad anarchy has already started, is already existing in some sense. And if it's not existing, I don't think the police are the ones who are keeping it together. I would just say it's cultural and norms that are keeping it together. If anything, police are undermining those cultural norms when they get away with murder and get away with theft. That would be my point. So thanks for doing this.
I generally agree. I think, why doesn't crime take place? Because people don't want to commit crime. Most people are pro-social and they don't want to be committing crime. Now, I think you might be able to do it if it's against a faceless individual or whatever. Yeah, but like local violent crime and like robbery and theft, people generally don't want to do that. And this is a general thing. When I see the police, I don't like seeing the police. I always get annoyed seeing the police, not just because I see them on the road being a pain and going, oh, they're trying to get them speeding. But when I'm walking around the streets, I don't like seeing the police because I don't know. I kind of see them as like an occupying force. I have no confidence at all that they'll do anything in my interest. And if anything, they'll do anything against me. Now, maybe that's because I don't know them and whatever. And via some of my karate stuff, I've come across like ex-policemen. But again, then there's a system of, then there's the issue of like the individual policeman, and then there's a system. Because I've dealt with some of the policemen, but they were all right. But then the other guys in police are an absolute pain because they're just careerists. And then you can get good individual policemen, definitely. But definitely the way the system works as well, again, it attracts the wrong type of person. And I think that's what you've got to be really careful about. Loads of things is, who are you going to attract to do these certain things? This is one of the reasons I very much dislike the schooling system. Is a very top-down thing, and it's all very micromanaged. You're just encouraging people who love micromanaging and power trips over kids to become teachers, because who's going to thrive in that environment? Those types of people. So yeah, your point and Gillis's point, who attracts, is very important. Just now, I'd like to thank everyone for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to us on Podbean and on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings, and the more people can access this material. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason at all, please contact us at mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com.